As you see, this is one of the challenges I was mentioning earlier, because we do have only 1 hour. We have 5 speakers, we are missing one, and a whole host of issues to discuss about a region which expands from the Balkans all the way to the Caspian Sea. We'll do our best to keep it within the hour while not losing substance. The whole idea of the panel being the first multi-speaker panel of the forum is to really lay down the issues, lay down, present, take a picture, take a snapshot, if you want, of the geopolitics along the East-West corridor, as I was mentioning earlier. We will not only be talking about the Black Sea, because we think it's extremely important to expand the whole strategic concept, if you want, to include the Balkans as well, and Ivan will speak to this, I'm very sure. We will not be going probably as deep as we would like to and as you would like to into some of the issues. These will be laid on the table, and we'll try to explore them during the remaining of the discussions, either in parallel sessions or in panels like this one. As I said, this is only to take a snapshot of the current realities, geopolitical, economic, societal, along the East-West corridor. And to do this, we have 5 wonderful speakers. We do hope that Mr. Diaconescu will join us, but if not, we have, as I said, five wonderful speakers who come from countries along this corridor, or from countries with a strategic interest in the geopolitics of this corridor. The first speaker on my list is coming from Sweden, Henrik Hallgren. He is the chairman of the Eurasia Forum. And Henrik, I will ask you to talk a little, take this snapshot from a bird's eye view, if you want, of the entire corridor, and focus a little bit on the EU. How you think EU should be perceiving the new context, geopolitical context on the corridor, and how you see EU taking its interest further, if it does take the interest further. And I do want to remind you, you only have 5 minutes, so the challenge is even bigger than you thought.
Yes, it is indeed impossible, and I'm not even going to try to pretend to do anything but a starting point. When I saw this poster on thematics, I thought of my grandmother, who I spoke with about when she watched TV and talked about politics a couple of years ago. She said, you know, everything has gotten so bad out there. And this was 10, 15 years ago, and I just tried to explain that, no, it's probably because you get more news reporting. But today I'm kind of ready to agree. So where to start? Yeah, not in the EU, but I'll start with the Silk Roads, just briefly. Charles will talk much more about the US strategy for the region. There was the concept of the new Silk Road, the US under Hillary Clinton, the strategy to basically connect to the Central Asian countries, so the post-Soviet Central Asia countries, into trade and economic, mutually beneficial networks, and with an eye, I would say, to a large extent on the Afghanistan venture. Spoke with all the desk officers of the individual Central Asia countries, and basically asked them about the strategy for each of these countries, and what it came down to in number 1 priority was always Afghanistan. Now China has a different model. We have the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. Now the question is this different? I think it is different for the reason that this is not a regional concept. This is something that developed out of bilateral agreements between China and the individual countries. And only later has it developed into something that can be seen as a model. You can also see the development of a larger context in terms of the development bank initiatives that China has initiated, and I think they were taken by surprise themselves by the international interest in these development banks. So this means that probably this might develop into a more valid regional strategy by bilateral cooperation. It is also real the collaboration with Pakistan, for example, has several tens of billions of dollars involved, and it has a clear objective from China's trade perspective. Now, I would also say that yes, looking at a corridor is probably, this is not just one corridor. If you look from Central Asia, it is more of a crossroads. For example, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan in the past year, and there is an engagement, especially in Western Afghanistan and Herat region. What you hear about is Iran, because everyone has been doing trade. I spoke with a lot of business people, men and women, and all of them but one had experiences from or trade with Iran, and they never talk about Kabul, not to mention the US or the International Alliance. What is mentioned is India, which is sponsoring a big dam project that has been stalled since basically Soviet times, with a thought to connect the Iranian port of Chabahar to Central Asia for the purpose of Indian trade. So this is a more complex situation than this. Russia, of course, I think will be, Lilia Shevtsova talked very eloquently, as always, on the Russian strategic objectives. We have a lot of Russian structures that, if you look at it through that lens, have been conceived towards that end, the collective security treaty agreements, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Russian development assistance through, for example, the Eurasian Development Bank, which has a much stronger focus on and stress on a soft power, which is much more connected to hard power, I guess, in the Russian interpretation than in Europe. Now, if you get to Europe, I was at the signing of the TAPI pipeline in Turkmenistan and spoke with the representative of the EU Energy Commissioner, and he has been struggling a lot with the Turkmen authorities, mainly for the reason that he had to convince the Turkmens that EU was a credible actor, that we would actually buy the gas. So he had been trying to put together a consortium that would be a credible buyer in the eyes of the Central Asia states. Now, at the same time, China has been pushing through its pipeline projects from Turkmenistan, and the China National Petroleum Corporation is now a big contributor to the Turkmen state budget. So it says something about the European strategic weight in the region. Energy is, of course, an important topic, and that will be dealt with later, but that is, in fact, if you look at the European neighborhood policy, not mentioned as a European Union objective. When we talk about the neighborhood policy, we're talking about that we want a prosperous and secure neighborhood of friendly neighbors, and the last can be interpreted as democratic or rule of law, depending on the context. The economic progress of that in the Eastern Partnership especially has been quite substantial, of course. The Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement is being implemented in 3 of the partnership countries. Now, one point to make on that, I guess, is that it also highlighted the deficiencies of the European policy in terms of security policy. And perhaps that is due to the fact that if you look at, perhaps the DCFTA was not so deeply and comprehensively founded within the countries. And that might have been the reason why this normative objective didn't really fit with the security objectives. So, just final points about geopolitics. Just a few points to note for the coming discussions, perhaps. There was a lot of talk 10, 15 years ago about transnational actors. These are rarely seen nowadays. These can be business actors. I mean, I spoke, for example, with businesses near the conflict, near the border in Ukraine, and they know exactly the needs of the population who has to travel across the de facto border. There are also transnational actors like the Islamic State. which, if we don't call it ISIS or ISIL, has recruited a lot of people in Central Asia, is becoming a factor in Afghanistan, is in Libya. And that's something that, this is of course not IS, automatically IS fighters who have, and officials, if you will, who have taken over Afghanistan. No, it's people who have converted because they believe in this. And this is not possible. It's not possible to become an American citizen by just saying so. Right.
How do you see the interaction between these actors developing, unfolding in your part of the world, and in general? How do you see the new reality, the new geostrategic reality in Southern Caucasus?
Very important forum, very timely, taking into account, the developments in the world, and especially in our part of the world, and specifically in our region, which, as you know, stretching between the two seas, Black and the Caspian Seas, being in a very interesting, I would say, neighborhood. I would call it a rough one. And developments when just little green men can change entire landscape of our part of the world. So we live in the interesting times, I would say, if I rephrase a bit, the Chinese famous, curse, I wish you to live in the interesting time. We live in a region, I represent the region South Caucasus, I am a Georgian, which has, different actors. We have one big power with a very special, function and role, which tries to satisfy its ambitions, through its military capacity. And we've talked in a very eloquent way in the last, conversation about Donetsk and Damascus. It's very interesting, kind of, metaphor. We have, two regional powers, Turkey and, newly emerged for our region, Iran, after this, successful negotiations on a very specific issue. And we have, our immediate neighbors, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And whenever we talk about these developments in the world and in the Middle East, I'd like all of you to remember, looking at the map, that everything is just very close. And it takes just about 1 hour, 30 minutes just to reach by plane from Tbilisi, capital of Georgia, Damascus or Kirkuk or whatever. So all developments, like in chaos, theory, a butterfly in Iraq can impact developments in Georgia, in Ukraine. So speaking about broader area, Black Sea, Caspian, of course, we have, different, clusters, different affiliations, different, strategic alliance. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey. We have very good relations with our another neighbor in Armenia. Ukraine is our strategic ally, and I wish all the best to our colleagues and friends, in their fight for independence and sovereignty. And let me just share in a very brief, because we are short of time, some ideas about what's going on in my own country. Georgia looks like, it's not my personal assessment, but assessment made by European Union, European Commission, that Georgia looks like a leader among Eastern partners. And of course, we are not perfect. Still a lot of things we need to accomplish. We are at the beginning of the process. It's not the end of Europeanization of Georgia. We have to go, long way. But again, we are committed. We are committed to do that. We are committed to modernize Georgia, but at the same time, I'd like to tell that it's not only about, reforming and modernizing Georgia, making it a capable state, but Georgia should, base all these, reforms and these processes going on in our country on basic elements of democracy, values, principles, and it's very important for us, modernization and democracy, building. Of course, I can talk long about these, different, things. We are engaged. Georgia signed association agreement. We are, just engaged fully with the European union with this DCFTA, and my message, to our friends and colleagues here would be, that it's not only about Georgia-European Union interaction, but this interaction, this project is open for our neighbors and everybody. And that's, by the way, the approach understanding of Georgia that, security, stability, cooperation, prosperity, as well as independence and sovereignty are indivisible, interdependent, interconnected, and success of Georgia belongs not only to Georgians but to Azerbaijani, Armenians, Ukrainians, and Moldovans. Of course, there is no way to avoid one big neighbor, Russia, and we had, a very interesting panel before our own. Of course, Russia is, at least, from Georgian perspective, revisionist power which wants to dominate, to influence. It's a country, and we talked about that, which still confuses, different definitions, between interest and influence. They want to influence, they want to control. They interpret different way all this, well-known and accepted by the civilized world and democratic community notions as stability, security, cooperation, neighborhood, their own version of these notions. And that's the reality, and Russia for Georgia is an occupant country which occupies Georgia's territory, 20% of that. But on the other hand, and from this podium, and I think the forum at this event, we should not talk not only about problems, but we should find out ways out. I think there is a couple of very simple facts on the ground, and one is that we cannot change our geography, and we need to live, with our neighbors, and specifically with our Russian neighbor. And there is one very concrete, message for this audience and those who listen to us, is that Georgia wants to live with Russia. Georgia does not want to live in Russia. Yeah, it's quite easy for any Georgian to, comprehend. It's not easy to understand, in a very simple way for our neighbors. But again, we are ready for dialogue. We are ready for rational, good neighborly relations with Russians, but at the same time, not at the cost to surrender, consider our, national strategic interest.
I also want to turn to your other neighbor, which is Turkey, also in a very interesting and complicated situation right now. Turkey is really at the intersection of two regions which are under fire, literally, and which are rifted with conflicts and violence. Sinan, how does Turkey see its role now, not only in the Black Sea region, not only in the southern European neighborhood, but how does it see its role in general as a member of NATO, as a still aspirant to EU sometime, and defending its own integrity and its own power while crossing through turbulent times inside the country as well?
I indeed come from a country where some of the issues that we're discussing here today, especially on the security side and the challenges thereof, have been laid to bear very tragically a few days ago with a suicide attack in Ankara. Now the number of casualties is more than 100. And that's really been a deep shock. It's been a traumatic experience, but that just illustrates the very difficult backdrop of the environment that I will be talking about. Indeed, what we see looking from Ankara outwards, both towards the Black Sea, but even more particularly towards our southern flank, is really a breakup of the old order. Now, what we discussed on this panel, even before, was essentially about the possible breakup of a World War II order. What we're seeing is a breakup of a World War I order, and that has enormous and very different consequences. The breakup of the World War II order was about what is essentially about the revisionism of Russia, mostly, and trying to sometimes successfully, acquire territory, challenge the security of nation states, but we, by and large, have developed quite a bit of experience over the Cold War years in terms of how to respond to these challenges. Sometimes more successfully than others, but there is accumulated evidence. What we're seeing on our southern flank is, again, something of different. The dynamics are different, and I'll just give you a few ideas about how different they are and try to summarize at the end about what we can do. Now, what do we see as a result of this possible collapse of the Sykes-Picot arrangement? We see the collapse of states. It's difficult to talk about the integrity of nation states in this region, in particular, obviously, in Syria. Iraq is another case. We see the disappearance of physical borders. Now, there is no border between Iraq and Syria, unlike what you see on the map. We see the emergence of non-state actors, like the Islamic State. We see the rise in both pre-modern and post-modern dynamics. What I mean by pre-modern is essentially sectarianism. A lot of what's going on in this region is driven by sectarian rivalism, but also postmodern in terms of, especially towards the future, for instance, some of the scenarios that is being talked about, the future of Syria, is not going to be along the borders of a nation state. So all of this, all these different dynamics, which paint a very different backdrop than what we see in other parts of this geography, have led to the congruence of a number of different factors of instability. A few examples of those: refugees. When we look at the refugee situation, sure, there is certainly a flow coming from Northern Africa, but a lot of what we've seen recently is the tragedy related to people who are trying to escape the uncertainty of their own reality in Syria, in Iraq. In Turkey, the number of these refugees is now about 2.2 million. So from 2011, when the Syrian crisis really started in earnest, until now, that is the number of refugees. And now, more and more of them are trickling down to Europe. So there is an outflow of these refugees towards Europe. And that's why we're seeing some of the more alarm bells in terms of how Europe itself is going to deal with this. Another factor of instability, briefly I referred to in my previously, is about the Islamic State. It's about radicalization. It's about how we manage the rise of entities like the Islamic State that challenge very significantly the established order. It's also about the collapse of any significant constructive framework of collaboration based on economic partnership. We looked at this region back just before the Arab Spring, where there were a number of well-intentioned economic initiatives try to usher in a period where there could be collaboration between some of those governments. Of course, that era is a bygone era now. And instead of economic collaboration, what we see really is a deepening of a security nightmare. Now, we have, as a result of this, we really have entered some uncharted waters, uncharted territory. Also uncharted because both at the nation state level, but also at the international level, institutional level, and also from the viewpoint of the security architecture that we have developed in the West, we don't really know how to deal with these phenomena. We're not well equipped to deal with this. And just again, a case in point is the refugee issue. When you look at how difficult it has been, even within Europe, first of all, to come to terms with what this represents. And secondly, try to develop a common approach to this, we see how difficult that is. Another example is NATO. NATO has been set up to fight, to deter, essentially a state-to-state challenge against Russia. So the whole security philosophy based on deterrence works if you have an actor on the other side that will be impacted by the whole deterrence outlook. And that has been NATO's concept for a long time. When we look at the latest NATO strategic strategy, there as well, we see very much the imprint of this approach. So even our core security institution like NATO today lacks both the posture and the instruments to deal with some of these factors of instability that I've tried to outline. How do you deal with radicalization? How do you deal with all these difficulties that come about as a result of these radical movements?
Sinan, if I may, I would like you to stop here for now. So, Ivan, how do you see the situation from your region, from the Balkans, and how do you see, once again, I do want to reiterate this question, how do you see EU and US acting towards solving the situation in your region and throughout the entire corridor, really?
Well, after hearing all this, you probably won't be surprised to hear me say that all things being equal, the region of the Balkans is an oasis of peace. And that is largely due, one, as Tedo said, to mere geography. You suffice to look at the map and to see that this is what I call part of core geographic Europe. There's no question about whether this is Europe or not. Secondly, in geopolitical terms, you see that it is completely now, or at least the unintegrated Euro-Atlantic part is completely encircled by NATO and EU members. And so, to your question on the EU, it is now about the credibility of Europe, whether it is capable to integrate these remaining countries, which constitute roughly 18 million people, which is a drop in the bucket of the 500 million people that constitute the European Union today. And I believe that this is a key issue that I would like to stress. If the EU is not capable of integrating this last bit of core geographic Europe, how is it going to deal with issues that we have been just talking about, the challenges afield?
Capable or willing?
Both. And I think that the so-called Berlin process that Chancellor Merkel initiated last summer to re-engage the enlargement process with the Western Balkans, I think is an attempt at a response to this. We can discuss, how strong or weak it is, but I think it is the key one that moves forward. Clearly, it goes without saying that the burden and the onus of the change and meeting the conditionalities is on the societies themselves. 95% of the work needs to be done in a domestic arena, but we need to tango together with the European Union, and the United States is fundamental there. I would say that there has been a reawakening in various institutions in Washington, the State Department, the White House. For example, the Serbian Prime Minister did 2 visits to Washington in the course of these past 3 months. He was received by Vice President Biden just 2 weeks ago, and Secretary Kerry, and I think it's very good to see. And again, it is, quote unquote, thanks to what Mr. Putin has been doing. There has been a sort of, how would I say, we felt we were on automatic pilot in terms of Euro-Atlantic integration, as Lilia and others have said, and that in fact, when Chancellor Merkel in Australia gave her speech and said, well, Russia could potentially be disruptive. Russia has been playing the kind of nuisance value role from the Baltics down to the Black Sea area. As I said earlier, the energy relationship is key to that, but we must also bear in mind something that, for example, in this Western Balkan region that is unintegrated, Serbia, which is the biggest country of 7.3 million people, is 3 times smaller than Romania. What I'm saying is these are weak and small economies. Big investors are not interested in small markets. Thus, the need for regional cooperation, and I would include everything broadly, Turkey and everyone, in the region that you are mentioning, we need to come together. The famous French philosopher Montesquieu in the 18th century talked about the soothing effects of commerce. Obviously, it's not the only thing. There are the geopolitics, but we need to keep reminding ourselves. And I would say, to make a general statement, that our business people, at least those who I know, are the more enlightened one, and realize that we need to think beyond our mini countries and our mini region to find those scales that can actually be attractive. Because without foreign direct investments, and I would like to underscore something that we're all aware of, but this is the framework within which we are acting. It is the deep economic crisis that we are all still involved in. The lack of growth, barring exceptions, is detrimental to any bolder political moves. And even given that, I think that this region has shown, I will mention the Belgrade-Pristina agreement, where intractable issues can be resolved. And I'd like to mention that Cyprus is moving forward, that the two negotiating sides, let's not hold our breath, but it seems after 40 years, they are moving and inching closer. So if we could get some wins there, it would be, I think, very good for the broader issue that you're mentioning.
How do you see the developments throughout this entire region, and how do you see U.S. role, and indeed the transatlantic relation, evolving around European neighborhood and Balkans included?
If on the internet you want to get a lot of clicks to your thing, you come up with something that's called a listicle. A listicle is a list of 6 ways to lose weight without eating less, or something like that. So I'm going to give you a listicle of American interests in the, if you will, the Donetsk to Damascus axis at this juncture. Number one, I think, is stability and reform in Ukraine. We talked about whether the sanctions are working. We want to see the country not be a problem in the future. Number two, we talked about this last night, the Syria-Iraq front. It's rolling back, stopping the advance and rolling back ISIS, avoiding a Libya-type outcome for Syria in the future, pressing the Russians to do less. We tried to press the Russians not to come, and to strengthen the Iraqi institutions. Number three, stability in Turkey. I think Washington is very concerned about renewed violence in Turkey, but Turkey's commitment to the anti-ISIS fight, Turkey's relationship with the Kurds. Number four, we want to deter Iranian adventurism after the Iran nuclear agreement. Obviously, you want to keep the Iran nuclear agreement in force, but you want to deter some sense that the Iranians might do things with new resources that they get from sanctions relief that would make the whole nuclear deal look like a chump's game. Number five, and this is kind of coming to the fore again, we tried it last year, but we'll try again, a renewed look at Israel-Palestine. The violence in Jerusalem is very worrisome for all Israelis, very worrisome also, I think, in Washington. Number six, I think we want to help Greece transition to growth again and stability. We have always been concerned that deterioration, shift to a very radical leftist government in Greece would undermine Greece's commitment to NATO and so forth. And number seven, I think we want to build energy stability. We talked about that a lot here last year. We're concerned to deter Gazprom's inroads into energy security in these parts of the world and their use of that for political purposes. And I think if you look back across the seven on Ukraine and on the Greek situation and energy, there's been some good news. At least things are stabilized and maybe heading in the right direction. Almost all the rest are bad. So if I still have time, I'll give you three sort of overarching Washington interests in Europe as a whole. Number one, we want to strengthen NATO, rally NATO to become an effective force to deter the Russians from further adventurism on the European periphery. We want to prevent and contain the migration crisis to lead to a bigger crisis in Europe. Number three, I think we want to prevent Brexit. Washington looks at Brexit with a great deal of alarm. And number four, and a particular favorite of mine, is we need to get the TTIP done. And that will really require the German leadership and commitment to getting TTIP done. So without any elaboration or analysis, that's my listicle.
Okay, this is very difficult to do. I do still want to push you back on the transatlantic relation a little bit. And how do you see this evolving? Do you see it being strenuous after everything that's been going on in the European neighborhood and EU's very slow reaction and EU's very incapacity to really regroup? Or do you see it as not being affected? Do you see Syria as having any sort of impact on the transatlantic relation?
I've spent 25 years working on the transatlantic relationship and lots of other crises. Ivan will remember very well the beginning of the Balkan crisis in the early 90s. Jim Baker's first approach was that this is Europe's problem to solve, this is Europe's moment, et cetera. And the United States got involved in that quite reluctantly. We've had lots of other crises, the Siberian gas pipeline, over and over and over again, but we always find ways to work with it. Now, what's in my era, it was an era of growing sort of EU collectivization of its policies, of foreign policy and so forth. That era seems to have stopped. Europe is a much more intergovernmental, and with Britain withdrawing from EU institutions, it's more a German-led relationship. And the United States has adapted. I mean, we don't have a sort of a preferred way for Europe to organize. I used to joke that we were actually the best European that there was because we always believed that whatever institutions would work, and most Europeans were much more cynical. That said, if Angela Merkel is going to make decisions for Europe's benefit, and certainly with respect to Ukraine, with respect to migration, very responsible, forward-thinking, courageous decisions, we're going to work with Angela Merkel. We'll work also with Francois Hollande, and we'll work with the European institutions, whatever it takes. But we're past the era in which sort of Washington was divided between the people who believed NATO was the core of our transatlantic relationship and the people who believed that the EU is the future. The NATOists didn't want Europeans to develop any defense identity or all these kinds of things. That's gone, completely gone. We're just delighted to have a partner to work these serious problems, and that's the way I think the administration, not only this administration, but any future administration of whatever party will approach the transatlantic relationship.
The relation between Turkey and Russia has been constantly good throughout 2008, after everything that's been happening then and afterwards. How is the relation now with Russia's involvement in Syria, Russia violating Turkish airspace? And if this relation is indeed changing, what does it mean? What does it mean for Turkey? What does it mean for the region, if it means anything?
Indeed, there was a paradox in this relationship in the sense that Turkey is a NATO country. Obviously, it has been critical of Russia's move towards in Ukraine and its aggression towards NATO. However, the two sides on Syria did something quite surprising. They were backing very different outcomes, with Turkey championing regime change in Syria and Moscow obviously supporting the Assad regime. But Ankara and Moscow were able almost to agree to disagree on this. And even though it was such an important component of Turkish foreign policy, they were able to leave that behind in a way, or outside of the scope of their bilateral relationship. And it hasn't affected the bilateral relationship. So the energy collaboration went ahead, economic collaboration went ahead. We've come to that end, to the end of that delicate, if you want, brinkmanship, this ability of balance this thing out. With the Russian buildup in Syria, we have seen a harsher rhetoric coming out of Ankara, even threatening to wind down some of the both energy collaboration, but also with regard to natural gas, but also in relation to the first nuclear power plant that Russia was going to build. So this is a signal that things may be changing between Turkey and Russia. Now, that will have several implications going forward, but nonetheless, we've really reached, it seems, the end of this delicate balancing act. Syria, from now on, is going to have an impact on the bilateral relationship, and therefore the new era of Turkish-Russia relationship, if you want, will be much more difficult to manage. So I would expect Turkey to become more critical of Russia, especially if, and that's not a scenario that we can totally rule out, there is an accident because of the airplanes that are now in aggression of the Turkish airspace. So that's a scenario that we can't totally rule out, but at the end of the day, there is going to be a hardening of the tone, which will have an impact on policy.
Please feel free in commenting on what was said or asking questions to the panelists. And can you please help me with the microphone? There is Kurt right there, and then Mr. Fota on the other side.
But my question is to this panel, I mean, are there any hopes in Turkey or even a will to even join the European Union still right now? Is there any hope in Georgia? And do you think, Ivan, that in Belgrade some people are really doubting that it will ever happen? So has our enlargement, our biggest and most important instrument, maybe come to an end? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Ries, I listened with great interest to your list of US priorities for Europe and Middle East. You mentioned Russia only in the Syrian context. On the other hand, I totally agree with you. We need the Europe whole and free. But the main problem today and the main risk for Europe whole and free is the Russian strategy of dividing the Europeans among themselves, but also the Europeans from the Americans. So my question is to you and also to Ivan, because Ivan, you spent a lot of time in Washington. How do you see the relations of US with Russia, and how do you see a strategy to counteract this big and large and very professional strategy of Russia to divide us, either us, the Europeans, but also to divide us, the Europeans and the Americans?
I only explicitly mentioned Russia in the listicle in the context of Syria because it's in the news, but obviously Russia is very much behind the reason that Ukraine is at the top of the list, is, you know, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. It's also very much the core of the energy security agenda, which is deterring Russia acquiring a dominant position that they can use for political relations. And when you look at our overall relationship with Europe, and the reason that we are trying to revive and refocus and, you know, the NATO readiness issues that we've been talking about is because of Russia. If when the wall came down in 91, 92, people were actually seriously talking, do we need NATO anymore? We don't have an enemy, you know, why do we need NATO? Those issues are nowhere on the agenda because, in fact, Russia is attempting to reinsert itself in the agenda kind of across the board. And that will require the West to respond across the board and to think a little bit further about the kinds of incentives and disincentives that might bring Russia around to a more constructive participation in the liberal world that we heard about in the last session that might be a potential down the road. So, you know, as George Kennan would say, it requires consistency.
Thank you. Ivan, enlargement?
It's, of course, a very good question. I'll just repeat that it is about the credibility of both sides of the European Union and these countries and their commitment, and that's why I have been consistently saying that the soft power of Europe works here unevenly, but you know, the fact that these countries want to join, even the European Union in the state that it is today, know that there simply is a little more predictability, a little more certainty, and a little more prosperity if you are part of the 28. Because let's not forget, the European Union is in its fundament a political peace project, how to avoid war after the World Wars I and II that Sinan mentioned. And for now, it's been pretty successful. I mean, it has avoided war, whereas we went to war in the middle of Europe when we shouldn't have, my country, at the end of the 20th century, even though we learned the same lessons as everyone else. There is a strain now within even the very pro-European people. I go to Belgrade often, and I have some friends who say, look, we are Euro fanatics, but they are losing us. People feel that because there isn't the kind of dynamic movement forward, step by step, and people only need to feel that there's a movement of an inch by day. They know that there won't be any grand kind of movement. But if there is a sense of movement, it's okay. If there's a sense of, do they really want us? I mean, you know, not to mention Turkey, obviously. Yeah. And actually, there was someone just yesterday, the day before, we might be looking at a Turkish scenario. These are kind of the pessimists. We're saying, okay, they'll open chapters, we'll begin negotiating, and then who knows, ad calendas grecas. So I think it's very important. This is why I insist on the Berlin process and Chancellor Merkel taking the lead again on this issue. But you know, we need to work. You have to get up every day and work on it. Again, first and foremost, our countries themselves in proving that they are trustworthy and reliable partners. And I think there has been some movement on that. Clearly, the migration crisis, the economic crisis are all challenging there. Let me just say a word on the U.S.-Russia. The new strategic document that is, most of you know, being written by our colleague and friend Natalie Tocci, an advisor to the High Representative Federica Mogherini, you know, talks about the world in which we are as a connected, contested, and complex world. And that's a kind of very broad way of answering that question. You know, we needed the Russians on the Iran deal. US needed Russia for its logistics in Afghanistan because it was the cheaper and easier route to go through. On Syria, it's very complex and contested, and yet somebody decided to go in and do it. Europe, as we heard from Lila, seems not to want to somehow go in there and is trying to deal on the sidelines, and yet we all know you need to treat these things at the root causes. Nobody is happy in the way that the Russians are doing, but I would personally surmise that there is, you know, unadmitted, what's the word, satisfaction that somebody is doing something. Now, maybe it'll all go wrong, and, you know, we have seen in the first days that they weren't bombing, you know, those who we expected they would bomb. Who knows how this will end? But, and Assad, clearly, although everyone would like to see him gone, he is possibly a first step towards a solution. How these things come together, we'll see.
Sinan, have you given up hope?
No, never. But I think what we're looking at, and here I want to paraphrase something that I heard from a seasoned British diplomat. They had launched an inquiry after 1979 as to how come they didn't see the Iranian Islamic Revolution coming. And the sort of outcome of that inquiry was that it was not so much a failure of information as much as a failure of imagination. And I think what we're looking at today in trying to analyze what we're seeing around us is exactly that. We have a lot of information, but how that information is going to come together, where it's going to lead us, that is really uncharted. So in that sense, hope, I wouldn't phrase it as hope. I would more phrase it as us trying to be ready and trying to overhaul our whole thinking, our institutions, our instruments, and fundamentally the way that we collaborate with each other to tackle these challenges. Because these challenges are quite unique, and their combination, as I've tried to outline, whether it's regarding refugees, whether it's with regard to radicalization, whether it's regard to disappearance of borders, is going to create, as you said it at the beginning, and you know the title of this, a perfect storm for all of us.
Thank you, Henrik. You have the final remarks.
On the enlargement, I completely agree that for the Balkans, the enlargement is, of course, the most important instrument and the most important issue. And it's very good to realize that, because whenever EU has a foreign policy, it, of course, has to take into account the counterparts' interests. But there are two processes at play, right? There is the enlargement process triggered by the external threat, perhaps threat perceived from Russia. There's also the financial crisis and perhaps also the refugee crisis, which are triggering the process of tighter integration within the European Union. And these two, we have to make sure to find a way that these two are not irreconcilable. If they are irreconcilable, I think that the European Union in any case doesn't have a choice. We need something else than the enlargement process. And this was the reason for the neighborhood policy to be invented, and especially for the Eastern Partnership, to give countries a prospect of improving their governance in line with the European Union without the perspective. And we have to extend it even further to the countries that will never be part of the EMP, if we are to have a realistic agenda for Iran and Central Asia, for example.
Thank you very much.